Welcome to the Mortarboard, the administrator's source for solutions in higher education. We tell you about challenges other schools have faced, benchmark the problem, share their best practices and epic fails, and invite you to consider whether what worked for them might also work at your institution. Hosted by longtime college president Dr. Dan Barwick, this is the Mortarboard, the source for solutions in higher education.
Welcome to the Mortarboard, your source for solutions in higher education. I'm Dan Barwick. Welcome to the podcast. If the content of this podcast interests you, then you'll enjoy my new book, Risk and Reward: How Small Colleges Get Better Against the Odds. It's now available from Amazon in ebook, paperback, and audiobook format. The best way to find it is to head over to my blog, mortarboardblog.com, and click on the link on the front page. If you have any thoughts about the book, don't hesitate to send me an email and let me know what you think. My guest today is Callie Clark, Senior Research Associate at the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice, and author of Decoding College: Stories, Strategies, and Struggles of First-Generation College Students. Callie's research focuses on education systems and how education policies and practices produce inequalities for first-generation college students, students of color, underrepresented students, and students from low-income backgrounds. Prior to joining Hope, Callie worked as a researcher with the UChicago Consortium on School Research for 7 years. In addition to her formal training in education research, Callie brings a great deal of practical experience to her understanding of equity in higher education. Before entering graduate school, Callie served as the founding college counselor in a Chicago high school, predominantly serving students of color and students from low-income families. She received her doctorate in social service administration from the University of Chicago, where she was an Institute of Education Sciences predoctoral fellow. Callie was the project manager for the study and subsequent report entitled Supporting the Whole Community College Student: The Impact of Nudging for Basic Needs Insecurity. Callie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
We last had a guest from the center nearly 2 years ago. Can you take a moment to tell us about the center and what you do there?
Sure. So I am a senior research associate at the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice. So we've been around. We're research center at Temple University in the School of Medicine there, founded by Sarah Goldrick Rabb. The Hope Center has been in this incarnation at Temple for about 3 years now. Previously, Sarah had done the work at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, under the Hope Lab, but for the last 3 years, we have been the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice at Temple University. And what we do is we focus on action research. And what that means is that we do your typical research that you would find in an education organization. We do surveys, we do experimental designs, we do a lot of different studies, but we have a unique approach to where that research lives. We take that research and we work with colleges and universities by providing them technical assistance to turn that research into action. We also have a very strong policy arm, which works with state and federal government to shape the policy conversation around equity in higher ed and students' basic needs. And then lastly, we have a strategic communications department. The conversation around students' basic needs is an important one to have. And we believe by focusing our efforts into these various different buckets, we can shape not just the conversation and the policy, but the action on the ground to turn that research into movement. And we call that a real college movement. And what that means is we're focused on the real life experiences of college students, the barriers that students experience on a day-to-day basis that may prevent them from realizing their higher education goals. And that often comes in the shape of basic needs and security, things like food, housing, homelessness, but also things like childcare, transportation, and access to mental health resources.
Your recent study was about connecting Texas community college students to resources addressing their basic needs for food, housing, and childcare. And by the way, if I've characterized that study in any way that's not correct, you're welcome to correct me. Before we talk about the study, can you discuss for a moment why this was an area that needed study? How difficult is it to help students get the resources that they need and are available?
Absolutely. So, one of the central things to the Hope Center's research is looking at basic needs and security. So, that's things like food, housing. It can also be access to childcare and transportation. These are the systematic barriers that can keep students from meeting their higher education goals. So that's what our area of expertise, that's really what we focus on. But what we see is a disconnect in the number of students who have those needs versus the number of students who actually receive help or support in meeting those needs. So since 2015, we have surveyed nearly 400 community colleges across the U.S. And overall, what we see, about 60% of students that we survey have some type of basic needs insecurity, whether that's food insecurity, housing insecurity, or homelessness. But when we ask those students, what type of campus resources have you used? What type of federal or state resources have you used? We see a large disconnect there. So by and large, most students are not reaching out or getting the resources that they need. And that can be for a number of reasons. Largely, they don't know how to go get them. We also deal with this other issue with stigma related to getting resources and this perception that other students need them more, that there's a limited supply of resources. And if they go in and seek out resources, that's taking those away potentially from another student who may need them more.
Isn't that touchingly generous when you think about it? Yeah.
It is. But at the same time, it really spoke to us about how important it is to communicate to students that their needs are important, that they're just as important as every other student, and that by going in and seeking out resources that they're not taking anything away from anyone else. And also to provide the information for how to go get those resources. It's very difficult navigating a college landscape, and to be able to find the resources on campus can often be a barrier in and of itself. And so that was really the impetus for this study. Amarillo College is amazing. They are really pioneers in trying to reshape how campus resources are viewed and experienced by students. So a few years ago, Amarillo College did an initiative where they really wanted to reshape how students experience resources on campus, and they created what's called the Advocacy and Resource Center, or what we refer to as the ARC. And the ARC holds all campus resources in one place. So we're not sending students from one end of campus to get tutoring assistance and another end of campus if they need help applying for SNAP benefits, formerly known as food stamps. So we're bringing all of those into one place where a student can walk in and no one knows why they're there until they share. So there's not an assumption, there's no stigma for when a student goes in there. It could be for anything at all on campus. And so by centralizing that and also providing case management for every time a student goes in, that student is connected with someone who's going to help them navigate the system of resources, figure out what they're eligible for, what they might be able to benefit for, and really help them apply for it. That is the concept behind the ARC, and it's become a central, almost social center of the campus instead of being a stigmatized resource kind of tucked away behind X, Y, and Z building.
Let's turn to the study. I'll ask you two very broad questions. How was it conducted, and what were the key findings?
Sure. So even though Amarillo College has this amazing ARC, and they've worked really hard to destigmatize going in and using ARC resources, there's still this disconnect between the number of students who could benefit versus the number of students who go in. And so this study was designed to see if we could encourage students to go into the ARC and use ARC resources. So to do that, we did what's called a randomized encouragement design, slightly different from our randomized controlled trial. We didn't want to keep anyone from having access to the ARC, and that's fundamental. Everyone has access to the ARC still in this study. But what we did is we took about 2,000 students who were either in the bottom quintile of income on the FAFSA or who were enrolled in developmental education, because those were two target populations that the Amarillo College wanted to focus on supporting. So we took students who met those criteria, about 2,000 of them, and then we randomly selected about 1,000, about half, to receive emails throughout the year from ARC staff to say, hey, come on in, happy beginning of the term. They were personalized emails. They had specific information about resources the ARC could use, and they were very friendly and open, and they were signed by an actual individual. So those went out throughout the year. And then what we did is we compared ARC usage for those two groups. So did students who received those emails, or what we call nudges to go in, did they go in more than students who didn't? Did they use more services than students who didn't? And then the later question that we looked at afterwards was, okay, did they have any different academic outcomes than students who didn't? What we saw by and large was that nudging students or encouraging them to go into the ARC did have an enormous impact on student usage of the ARC. So when we looked at the percent of students who went in at all, even once, it more than doubled. So from 22% to 56%. That's huge. So we could actually get students to go into the ARC. And that was our first and foremost question. Then we saw that students who did get those nudges to go into the ARC had incredible impacts in their passing rates for developmental education courses. So we looked at a subsample of students who were enrolled in developmental education, and we compared their pass rates to students who did not get those nudges to go on in. And what we saw was a 20% increase in passing. So that would be the equivalent of a pass rate of 59%, bump that up to 71% of students passing their developmental education courses in that first year. That's a huge impact and really was a delight to see. And it's consistent, students who do that in the first year, they retain and they stay passing in the second year. It's a really positive impact all around, and a really great way to kind of highlight that there are potential academic impacts for connecting students to the resources that they need.
Let me just ask a few contextual questions. So there's 2,000 students who receive these nudges, and you said they're by email only.
Yeah, so it was actually 2,000 was the sample, 1,000 received them. So half, and it was by email. So there are other, there are other methods of delivery that might be more appropriate for other institutions. In this case, they were by email. You always hear that college students don't read their email. Well, we find that they do.
Really? Because actually what prompted my question was I'm thinking about how many of my students, say how infrequently they're looking at their email.
I think it might depend on what the email says.
True.
But no, we try and make these emails be as enticing as possible, right? So we aren't asking anything of them. We're framing it in a very socially acceptable and inviting way. We're not presenting any additional barriers. I know when I open my email, if I think it's someone asking something of me, I'm far less likely to open it. I think that might play a little bit of a part, but we do find that students do read their emails, at least in this study, and that it did have a positive impact.
Just to clarify more about the context. So 2,000 students total in the study, 1,000 received the emails. Can you recall offhand, how large is the total student body at Amarillo?
Oh, yeah. So Amarillo College is huge. It serves absolutely thousands and thousands of students. So this isn't to say that, these 2,000 students are representing everyone at Amarillo College. By no means. To do something more to scale would, because Amarillo College is servicing a large number of full-time students, but also a really large number of part-time students and students seeking out certificates that might only put them in their one course over the course of a year and then return for another course. So there are definitely a lot of students on campus, and this is only a very small portion. So thank you for shedding light on that. This is true. This is not a very small college. This is a relatively large college, and the study was done with just a very small subset of students.
Still, I was amazed to see that passage rates of developmental education coursework, which, I know from my own work is a critical milestone toward a community college degree, increased significantly. I'm a teacher, and if someone asked me how to increase my students' pass rate by 20% without lowering my grading standards, I wouldn't have a clue. Have you seen in your past research, have you seen anything else that approaches this kind of result?
Oh, no. You can see positive impacts for nudging, and we had, and that was kind of our prior, right? But a lot of the nudging research done previously isn't specifically related to using campus resources in this way broadly, like to go into Campus Resource Center. And then we also don't look at developmental education outcomes at all from those previous nudging studies. So no, this is definitely a unique contribution of this work. And I think it comes from how we shaped the question. So can nudging connect students to resources on campus? And then we did the follow-up question asking about academic impacts, including developmental education, which I think is part of what's unique about the study and what it lends. It really looks at two different buckets of questions. We don't typically find that in previous nudging work.
I'm just curious, based on your experience, my daughter is a college student, and if I send her an email, I don't actually know how often she reads my emails. I don't think it's very often. But if I text her, I do get a response. Well, I would say typically within an hour or two. Now, I know that if her friends text her, she's responding within a nanosecond. But I'm curious. I'm sure you have thought about the possibility of texting students with the same nudging. What's been your experience with that? What influenced your decision to use email? I'm just curious about the methodology.
Sure. So we actually do have some other nudging studies currently running that use text, and they are different from this study. And there's some benefits and constraints for either approach. And so it really comes down to what the goal is and what the capabilities of the institution are. So, for instance, you make a great point that students are often more likely, or we at least perceive that they're more likely to read and respond to those text messages. But with a text message, you are highly constrained to the information that you can relay. And if you don't have a previous relationship, it is very difficult to build that rapport with somebody via text. So if it's someone we know, we can shoot them a text and say, hey, stop by in 15 minutes. And it's not interpreted as anything other than, oh yeah, dad wants me to stop by in 15 minutes. But if a stranger texts you that, you're not going by. There are constraints to text messaging when you're trying to get students to enter a space and to be vulnerable by saying that they need to, seek out resources. That's a very sensitive topic. And I think the emails allow us to build a greater rapport with students that you just aren't constrained with the number of characters that you can fit in a text, quite honestly.
The report states that you did not find clear evidence that nudge students completed more credits, received higher grades, or passed other courses at higher rates. Why might that be? And do you see any possibilities for increasing any of those?
Sure, absolutely. So when I saw that at first, I kind of scratched my head and I had to think about it. And then it really dawned on me that passing developmental education is that first critical milestone to so much else. So think of it this way. If students who had previously struggled with passing their developmental education courses and may have, for instance, decided to switch classes or leave the course, if those students stayed, right? Even if they struggled, that's a great thing because taking and passing your developmental education course is an actually really important marker towards progressing towards your degree. Whereas if you had struggled and decided, okay, I'm going to week 1 or 2, I'm going to go ahead and opt out of this class and go take X, Y, or Z class that may not move you towards that degree, that may not be the best the best avenue to progressing towards a degree, if that's your goal, which I think for a lot of us is the ultimate goal. So passing developmental education is huge. Now, do students who focused on those developmental education courses, even if they were challenging for them, if they decided to stick with it and pass those courses, those students may not have been able to take additional courses because they were focusing on that academic requirement, right? They may have academically received grades that would have been on par or maybe even a little bit lower than they would have if they had gone and taken an elective course, right? So the fact that we don't see impacts on the number of credits that students are taking or on their GPA at this point, to me, is not a negative outcome. What we see is passing that developmental education course is going to lay the foundation. And if, we have no idea what's going to happen a number of years down the road, but this was a very relatively short study, right? So if they're passing developmental education now, what would happen down the road? Would we see that passing developmental education translate into higher graduation rates? It wouldn't surprise me at all if we do. So yeah, I pause too. I think like a lot of people who are going to read this and wonder, that's interesting. But then when you really think about the temporal nature of what passing developmental education means, it kind of logically makes sense.
Well, I'm a college administrator, so I apologize for this, but I've got to ask you about costs and benefits.
Absolutely.
You're describing a pretty startling and beneficial result, and I was fascinated by the sheer number of students that are using that particular resource on campus. Mm-hmm. What are the resources needed to achieve those results? And what's going through my head, of course, is that the center on campus may be structured and budgeted in such a way, in a way that assumes that a relatively small number of students will take advantage of its services. I'm actually just wondering if that dramatic increase in the number as a result of the nudging, whether that has increased costs, to what extent, and whether it's proportional to the additional number of students that are helped.
That's a great question. So I think there's an important thing to remember in this study is that this increasing ARC usage was actually a goal of Amarillo College. So this isn't an unexpected byproduct. This was a goal that they were seeking, right? So strategically, Amarillo College was looking to increase ARC usage. And so those kinds of questions surrounding the funding and the financing, those had already been thought about and conceptualized but prior to, in fact, years before, when Amarillo College decided that they were going to make a commitment to meeting all students' basic needs on campus. And so that was a part of a strategic decision by Amarillo College far before this study happened. And so the increase that we see here is only a net positive for them. It is definitely a positive. Now, as far as the additional actual administrative costs of carrying something like this out, as far as the nudging goes, nudging is a very low lift if, one, you have the internal capacity to do so, right? So that's always it. You have to know your staff and know whether or not you have the staff to do it. But the time commitment and the cost of nudging is very, very low. Now, if you don't currently have campus resources on your campus, that's a very different question. That's a very different kind of avenue to pursue. We hope and we encourage all campuses to take a look at how they can bring their resources together and how they can identify and meet the needs of their students to be what we call a student-ready college instead of, we often hear the term college-ready student, right? So I used to be a high school college counselor in a very former life, and we had a lot of focus on making our students college-ready. But as a first-generation college student who navigated higher ed, I also had an inkling that, and I'd gone to a number of different types of colleges. Some of them were better at meeting my needs than others. And so I also knew that there was such a thing as being a student-ready college. And that is something we focus on at the Hope Center very, very much. One of the things Amarillo did to strategically try to be a student-ready college was they surveyed their students in previous years to find out what the needs of their students were and what they could do to meet the needs of those students. So this study is a part of a much larger strategic plan of Amarillo College. And it's definitely a big undertaking on the part of the college, but it is a great kind of ideal representation of what can be done with the type of strategic initiative, focus, and commitment to making your campus be a student-ready campus.
I understand that you're talking about an institutional initiative, an institution-wide initiative, but it does sound, from what you're describing, as if individual teachers could take something very specific and very helpful away from this. So anywhere from 10 to 20% of our listeners are faculty, and I'm a teacher. Although I work primarily as an administrator, I've never stopped teaching. I always teach. And when you're describing this, I'm thinking to myself, the amount of work required of me to send an email to my class, to this, which is obviously a very limited number of students, an email simply reminding them of the resource, periodically reminding them of the resources available to them on campus, would be unbelievably easy, requiring essentially no real effort at all. I'm curious, could we sort of what's the word where you're not scaling it up, where you're scaling it down? Where
I love that.
Where could individual teachers draw a lesson from this? I assume at any given time, I typically primarily teach for community colleges because I enjoy that very much. And so at any given time, I have a substantial number of my students who are presumably taking some developmental courses. They're all taking, obviously, lower level courses at the college. And I'm just wondering, what do you think would happen if a teacher were to adopt a regular schedule of reminding students of the resources that are available to them? And by the way, if you think that's a good idea, and you're free to say it's not, but if you think it's a good idea, how often should a teacher do that? How often were these nudges sent out?
Sure, that's a great question. So I'll actually start with your last question first and then circle back. So the nudges here were sent out sporadically throughout the year, about once a month. All right. So that's a kind of a separate thing than the nudging happening from an individual professor or instructor. So I also keep my finger in the teaching pool pie, and it's one of the things that I love to do, and I'm very happy that I can continue to do so. And this isn't a new concept. It's been endorsed by Sarah Goldrick-Rab, our founder, for years, but you might be familiar with the idea of doing a basic needs statement on your syllabus. I would say, and a basic needs statement in syllabus, I have one on my syllabus. We have an example of one on our Hope Center website if anyone needs. But what it is it's basically space on your syllabus that says, hey, I get that you're a student. Being a college student is hard. And there are a lot of you out there that may have additional challenges that you're experiencing in life that might put barriers to you reaching your higher education goals. Here are some resources that we have. I do on-campus resources and off-campus resources. So I, talk about what's also in the greater community available. It's really up to you how you want to structure your basic needs statement. But the idea is by putting that on the syllabus, by making it known to your students that one, you see them as humans, you see them as people navigating a life, not just a classroom. And that two, you are reaching out and willing to help them navigate that space, that can really foster trust, but also open a conversation. I do touch on it a few times throughout the term. I don't send something every week but I do touch on it throughout the term. And I make sure that my students know, like, hey, if you need any help navigating this class or this institution, in any way, shape, or form, whether it's about what we're learning here in my class or not, please reach out to me, because I see my role as an instructor, not just to bestow information, but to help them navigate the institution that we all find ourselves in, right? We're all here. And so I can be that gatekeeper that can open the gates to resources instead of keeping them closed. Part of that is really taking the time to learn what's on your campus before you put together that syllabus or before you have that conversation, to really look. And you might be surprised at how much or how little there is. But either way, I would encourage all instructional staff to do that, to take a stock of what's going on in your campus, and to really let that guide the conversations that you have with your students if you feel that that's something that you feel comfortable doing. You can also do the basic needs statement on your syllabus. That's a great way to communicate clearly to your students at the beginning of class that this is not something to be concerned or ashamed or worried about, that this is a normal part of being a college student, and that you can help them navigate it.
My guest has been Callie Clark, Senior Research Associate at the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice, and the author of Decoding College: Stories, Strategies, and Struggles of First-Generation College Students. Callie was the project manager for the study and subsequent report entitled Supporting the Whole Community College Student: The Impact of Nudging for Basic Needs Insecurity. Callie, thanks very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan.
Thanks for joining me. Please feel free to email me with questions, comments, or suggestions for content that you'd like to hear about. You can reach me at mortarboardpodcast@gmail.com. Consider stopping by my blog, mortarboardblog.com. The blog contains links to stories that I think will interest you, podcast transcripts, and articles I've written. You can also like me on Facebook at Dr. Daniel Barwick, or follow me on Twitter at Daniel Barwick. Looking forward to talking with you in the next episode.